All right, well, I'm now joined by Professor of Sociology and Political Economist, Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg, to just delve deeper into the debt crisis facing developing nations. Prof, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time. So this is a historic moment, not only for South Africa in terms of the G20 presidency, but for the African continent. But it does come at a shift in geopolitics, and now you have, the tariffs by the US. How much of, a significant problem will this further, put most of these developing countries into debt?
We'll see this, thanks for having me on that. We'll see this before November 22nd. Yeah. It's easy to predict because from the top, that pressure is Donald Trump not only putting tariffs on, getting rid of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, the 0% access to the US. Now, countries like Lesotho, they're making some blue jeans, 50% tariff, we expect. South Africa, 30%, plus the 10% hit because it's a BRICS country. These are the most insane moments for trade, but it's not stopping there. Inflation in the US will result because the consumers now have to pay that high tariff. And then the Federal Reserve, which sets the world interest rates, and they're going to say, inflation? Well, we put our interest rates up. And then that comes back to African countries. 3 have defaulted because of the last round of interest rate. Ghana, which was a very high growth, and so Zambia, and even Ethiopia just the day before it joined the BRICS in late 2023. These are times, let's say, from the top. And the middle meeting this week in Rio couldn't really do anything. They weren't strong enough to stand up and set up a new alternative to the IMF. They talk about it, they don't do it. Their BRICS Bank is really just for the 5 BRICS members, one of which, the original ones, Moscow, is being sanctioned. And then finally, from below, this week we also saw the Kenyan Gen Z protesting. Again, they're getting squeezed, the fiscal consolidation of the IMF. You remember a year ago, June 27, 2024, they protested at the IMF and World Bank, and they won concessions, and William Ruto, the president, had to kick out some cabinet members. But they didn't push through to what they demanded, the debt audit, to find out really what should Kenyans pay, how much is corruption, how much was the climate crisis adding to the debt burden.
Yeah, and I mean, it further then exacerbates the problem. So for especially those countries that are indebted. Prof, let's talk about the role of developed nations, especially, of course, when you look at lenders to these high costs, particularly the cost of servicing this high debt. What role do they play fundamentally?
Well, they're taking an enormous financial surplus out, partly because, as you've heard, it's unfair credit ratings which amplify the risk. Yeah, there's risk in Africa. There's not just the 3 that defaulted, but most of Africa, including South Africa, is junk rated, and therefore you pay a much higher interest rate. However, these credit rating agencies thought that Lehman Brothers, a big bank in New York in 2008, was doing fine. They got AA. So I would question their competence. And again, the BRICS promising a credit rating agency, not delivering, very disappointing. So yeah, that may mean the mistakes of Ghana going to the euro market, that is borrowing in hard currency. And too much hard currency comes in as loans because, if you're a bank, even the BRICS Bank, you don't want to lend in local currency, you're paying back in hard currency. So that's a big problem. As your currency falls, your debt obligations soar. And I think if Africa can get off that debt by demanding, a debtor's cartel to say debt audits, to really see what was corrupt, our corruption, we know from ESCOM, and Hitachi, which bribed our ruling party, and it's all out in the open because it was prosecuted successfully in the US, but that's the World Bank's biggest ever loan for Medupi coal-fired power station. It's that sort of debt audit and cancellation of odious debt that you see these activists last week in Seville in Financing for Development really insisting on, and that the West and BRICS pay climate debt, polluters pay, because that's why so much of the debt is so hard to pay, because we're dealing with revenues that shrink in Kenya because of locusts and floods and then droughts. And then we're dealing with the climate debt really by the West. They should be paying Africa.
I want to bring in the so what now element. I mean, we've been hearing that, in times of this kind of uncertainty and instability, there lies an opportunity there. I mean, we've heard in the G20 presidency, South Africa is proposing this cost capital commission to be established. What does that speak to, particularly as a lot of people are wanting South Africa, the African continent, to come up with solutions that are tangible for those who live in this continent?
Right. To me, first prize would be the debt audit, so you find out really what should be paid, how much was corrupt. And secondly, the West and BRICS paying climate debt to poor countries. They really owe under polluter pays. The third best would be this commission, but the problem is it's run by Trevor Manuel. He was very famous for having brought South Africa into the world in the 1990s, and he was even nominated to be the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. That's the stature. He's, unfortunately, the activists are critical. He's also currently the chair of Old Mutual, big insurance company, and Rothschilds. He's deputy chair of their local. Now that means his interests are not to cancel debt, to look at odious debt, to look at the climate debt. It's actually to get the countries to pay more. And I don't think that's a good match to have Trevor Manuel. And the activists are saying, now, how can we actually move forward in the G20 if we've got Donald Trump sabotaging it every step from above, cutting US aid, massive cuts, meaning the foreign exchange in a country's coffers is much, much reduced. So they're going to have to export more, but now there are tariffs. It's all terribly unfair.
Prof, we know that, of course, the declarations that will be made by the leaders in the G20 are not necessarily binding. But what are we likely to see in November at that Leaders Summit, particularly as you look at the various groupings that have been meeting under the various, tracks, the financial track, the Sherpa track?
Well, we've seen some of the civil society, some critical language there. There is a problem in C20, Civil Society 20, of a split, and the more progressive forces were sort of pushed out a few weeks ago. So I'm not expecting too much from those inputs that go into it. And then you look at what the G20 really represents. It's the G7, right, the West, plus the BRICS, and a few others. And if you put those together and you ask, well, what really are their interests? Because we have a big bank here. I'll mention the name, I hope it's not an advertiser, Standard Bank, and they're massively invested in African debt. They don't want to see debt cancellation, debt audits, climate debt payments, because they would be very much hard hit. And these are the sorts of contradictions. The G20 really isn't going to speak for its one huge member, the African Union. It was let in as a member in September 2023, but I don't think it has a very loud voice. I think it means the society has to get louder and say, just like these activists are, cancel the debt, polluter pays, odious debt audits. So we really know what can be done to reduce this in a systematic way. Otherwise, Kenya is an example. When you have rising protest, 44 killed last year, 11 killed this week by the police as citizens express their anger and their frustration.
Really sad times for that. But Prof, thank you so much for that. Of course, get louder, says the Prof. That was political economist Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg. Well, that's a wrap of the second edition of our G20 Focus. Coming up next Wednesday, we turn our focus on climate change, poverty, unemployment, hunger, inequality, environmental degradation, and climate change are but a few of the complex issues challenging the world today. The G20 is actively addressing climate change through its Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group. We asked the question, how is the G20 addressing climate change, given the call for enhanced climate finance mobilization for and by the G20 countries, particularly for adaptation and building climate resilience for developing countries?